change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. There's been times that I thought I wouldn't last for long. Oh, but somehow I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. And then I go to my mother. Mother, could you help me, please? Help me, please. She said I'd like to, I really would, but I'm just not able. And then I looked around, and I was right back down on my knees. There's been times I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. I was born by the river in a little tent, and oh, just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I am afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's out there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. There's been times that I thought I wouldn't last for long. Oh, but somehow I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. And then I go to my mother. Can you help me? I said, Mother, could you help me, please? Help me, please. She said I'd like to, I really would, but I'm just not able. And then I looked around, and I was just right back down, down on my knees. There's been times that I thought I would last for long, but somehow I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
Welcome. Oops.
I was
All right.
born by the river. It's been a long time coming, but
My apologies. That music just doesn't want to leave us, and I'm not upset about that. Before we begin, I just want to offer a few words about that song. That's, as you all may know, we probably are used to hearing Sam Cooke sing that song. That's Leela James and her version, and thinking about context and what it means, particularly for the conversation that we're going to be having today, and what it means in the context of change, and for folks who are coming in heavy-hearted, for people who are coming in elated. Perhaps you are coming in from communities where real progress and change is being made. You might be coming in from communities where you've seen some regression. There's something, and Lee and I were talking about this song earlier before we, you all first started joining us, and thinking about the end of that song where she sings, so I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me, please. And the person says, I want to, I'm not able. And then the singer says, and I find myself back down on my knees. And for some reason, that lyric really resonated with me today, thinking about the idea that we might be thinking someone doesn't help us. And I'm thinking about this in the context of our work, being in solidarity. And we might think that they don't want to. And there's a difference between someone being unwilling and unable. And so just wanted to lift that up, what it means to be unable for a wide range of reasons. Maybe there's too much risk. Maybe that person is in a different place on the continuum of journey. But just wanted to lift that up. And also, as heavy as that song sounds in spaces, it is a song, I think, of aspiration. I feel conflicted in many ways when I hear that song, the heaviness of what is, the possibility of what can be. So just wanted to offer that as context. Want to welcome you all here. So excited to be in partnership with one of my colleagues and just brilliant being on our earth, Lee Morrison. Got to give a shout out. I saw Mary Frances Winters a moment ago. I don't see you on my, there you are. Mary Frances Winters, whose footsteps, whose journey we are following. So very thankful for you and your partnership and your leadership, your guidance, your brilliance. Got some other folks from the Winters group here. If y'all just throw up some hearts or hands, because I don't see everyone on my screen. And before we get started, just want to offer, and really appreciative, people are still coming into the room. Welcome. Thinking about results still coming in. I recognize that some of us are also in places where it's not yet been decided, and holding space for that as well. And what does it mean the day after, to navigate political and legal resistance to the work that we do, to our diversity, equity, and inclusion justice work? Before we begin, I do want to offer and invite you to do a couple of things. Zoom, we have the power to manipulate a little bit. You can hover over your image and 3 small dots will appear, either with your mouse or your computer keypad. And if you click the three dots, there's a drop down. You have the capability to rename yourself. Want to ensure that you are showing up as the name that you want to be called. Also invite you, if you have encountered people often unfamiliar and unpracticed with the pronunciation of your name, I invite you to include the phonetic spelling so that we can be more in community. And I also invite you to include pronouns if you are so inclined and comfortable. It helps us, one, not make assumptions about one another, but also be more in community. And then finally, I invite you to come onto camera to be more in community and holding space for the wide range of reasons that might not be feasible. If you're in the state of Florida like me, we have an impending hurricane coming, so I'm hoping that my connection stays tight and clear all the way through. There could be family members that you are caring for. You might be in another space. I was with a session a few months ago, y'all, and what was lifted up to me as a colleague in the space from this particular client who said she was hired during the pandemic and virtually, and had never seen her colleagues and they had never seen her. And what she sent me in private message was that she was 420 pounds and had a fear, there is an actual name for a fear of being on camera, for fear of judgment from her colleagues. And I think that's important to lift up too in this virtual space. So just want to honor the ways and reasons we might not be able to be on camera and still invite you to be on camera. And this is a space where I invite you to practice self-care. If you need to turn your camera off and step away because the conversation is heavy, I invite you to practice and to do that too. I'm so excited to see so many familiar faces, and there are folks out in the Zoom space that I do not know. I am Chevara Orrin, my pronouns, she, her, hers. I'm a principal strategist with the Winters Group, where my areas of focus are race, gender, LGBTQ, social justice, and civil rights. I'm mother, daughter, sister, auntie, survivor of childhood poverty and incest and domestic violence, aspects of identity that inform how I show up, not just in our work, but in our world. I am daughter descendant of both immigrant and enslaved, the daughter of a white Jewish mother who's a civil rights, human rights, anti-war, anti-apartheid activist. And I'm also the daughter of James Bevel. My father is considered the father of voting rights in this country. He was the first to call for the march from Selma to Montgomery. And so I hold a certain reverence for voting in our nation here in the United States of America. I come to you today from land of the Tequesta, Calusa, and Seminole, colonized, stolen land here in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale, more specifically. Lee, who's going to be kind of my collaborator, colleague in this session, would love to have you bring your voice in and share with the good folks who you are.
Thank you so much, Chevara. So I am Lee Morrison. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a manager of learning and innovation here at the Winters Group. I've worked here for about 4 years in a variety of roles, and I am also a storyteller. I identify strongly as a storyteller. It used to be writer, and I've expanded that more recently. I am a queer white woman. I am college educated twice, and think about also the immense privilege in that. And I strongly identify as a lifelong learner as well as an educator in this space. And for me, those identities are closely entwined. And I am so excited to be joining Chevara in this conversation today. We really had a good time putting together the content as we also navigated all of this uncertainty and everything that has been swirling in our world, and just really excited to be sharing space with all of you today as we continue to process. So thank you so much, Chevara.
Thank you, Lee. I really appreciate, and this is so important to our work, right? How we lift up and hold space for our privilege, not in a way that feels heavy or as indictment, but as its gift, to have privilege. It also means we have responsibility. I appreciate you lifting up college educated. We over-index and we often over-privilege formal education, and that's showing up in our work too. And I appreciate the private message that was just sent in. There's someone else out there who's the product of a white Jewish mom and an African-American father. I appreciate you dropping that in private chat, which also means then, while I do not get misidentified as a white woman, I have proximity to whiteness, don't I? Yeah. So there is privilege around that. I am very curious, so curious about all of you. I invite you in chat to drop in. We want to know how you are entering. And as these election results are coming in, what are you experiencing? Is it fear? Is it hope? Something else? Also, I invite you to drop in chat. Who are you? So your professional titles are cool. I'm interested in aspects of identity that inform the core of who you are. So also in chat, if you'd also drop that in, just so we can see who's in the room. So professional identity, absolutely welcome. And aspects of identity that are core to your being and inform how you show up. Sad, perplexed. Thank you, Julie. Entering very concerned and disappointed. Fear for what this means for the work that we do. Sharon, yeah, Lee and I were just talking about that. As I mentioned, I'm here in the state of Florida, so many of you, we're going to talk about this a little later, but you probably heard the rhetoric from my governor in his speech last night. I felt unsafe. I felt scared for my life and unsafe. So that resonates. Grateful for the races in our state, Illinois, and excited about what's happening in Kansas, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Yes, Megan, it is possible to feel both hopeless and hopeful. And there were some monumental wins and some firsts across our nation last night, too. Thank you for that. Cheryl, yeah, the desire to leave Florida, a little discouraged about our DEI work here in Broward County. Cheryl, I've been on a quest for the past year. Every month I've been traveling internationally with part of that. Looking to see, I'm interested in nations that value peace. It's not a big list, y'all. But Costa Rica demilitarized in the 1970s, so they're kind of at the top of my list. So yeah, and that's really, and I'm smiling, but that's real, Cheryl. I felt fear last night. Fear, relieved that it wasn't a red wave. Yeah. Rashiv, it's interesting. The headlines there's been a lot of that, right? The red wave was really a red ripple. I mean, kind of that red trickle. Like I've seen headlines that suggest that. Rhea, development nonprofit professional. I am a married lesbian New Yorker, privileged where I live. Thank you, Rhea. Sharon, unsafe. Andrea, DEI strategist, daughter, orphan, sexual assault survivor, Black woman, storyteller, warrior. Waheen, thank you for that. Sarah, perplexed. Unsafe, jaded, exhausted, scared. I live in Texas. Tammy, thank you for that. Entering sad, despair, and also hopeful. Thank you, Kendra. Activist, aging, woman, white, friend, mom, and Nana. Julie, thank you. If we are all so privileged, we will all be aging, right? I think that's a really important one. Thank you for your vulnerability and lifting that up. Full of hope and fear. I'm experiencing fatigue at the intentional disregard for abundance and embrace of scarcity. Ohio. Thank you, Joanna. Mother, sister, friend, truth seeker, liberation fighter, feeling disappointed and also energized. Yeah, that's what that song is about, right? A change is going to come no matter what. Glimmers of hope and also fatigue. Thank you, Tamara. Trying not to go into fear, but to believe in the power of all of us. Osvaldo, Mexican-American, son of Mexican immigrants, raised as a migrant farm worker. First generation, master's educated, achieved my parents' dreams, hopeful yet sad for some of Oregon's election results. Gina, biracial Black woman, stayed up way too late last night watching election returns. Glad to be in Minnesota, sad, perplexed about Georgia, Florida, Ohio. Hopeful and somewhat relieved that it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Yeah, Gabby, it's interesting. I appreciate you lifting that up. It's context, right? It's contextual. Tammy, it was a red wave where I am. Thank you for bringing in that reality, because depending on where we are in this nation, we are having an awakening to very different realities. Very different realities. Feeling hopeful, biracial woman living in Western New York and thankful for our governor outcome. Happy with Minnesota. Hey, Stephen, Humrick House. A bit jaded, but glad for how some of the races turned out in PA and specifically Philadelphia. Yeah, thank you, Maya. Feeling curious, white, queer, bi-femme, class privileged, radical, anti-fascist, abolitionist, anti-capitalist. Latina, worried and Broward. Thank you, Adrena. Lifelong learner for sure, curious and highly motivated to agitate. Feels like we got better results than expected, but the stakes are extremely high. And the stakes are extremely high. We're going to talk about this a little later. Also, depending on where our intersection of identities collide. Yes. Sarah entering anxious, exhausted, mixed race, Black, cis, hetero woman, wife, mother, sister, daughter, auntie, cousin, born, raised in Jersey, living in North Carolina. Entering with concern, continued concern. Thank you, Rebecca. And hope, Puerto Rican, mom to school-age kids, queer, DEI professional, daughter, sister. Grateful for results in Minnesota. Thank you, Christy. Also sweating a little, given the closeness of the races. And given how we are none of us, and I so appreciate all of you being so vulnerable and dropping this in, we're not in silos, right? What happens in Minnesota absolutely impacts what happens in Mississippi. We are not in silos. Amazed with the additional efforts to further restrict voting rights, that it still didn't contribute to the red wave. Thank you, Megan. White, married, lesbian, CDL, living in a red state. No one I voted for won. Holding space for that, Darla. Perplexed about the vitriol against DEI. We're going to be talking about that. Southwest Asian, North African, mixed race, white cis woman, mother of 2 girls, yogi, queer, daughter of an immigrant, first-gen college graduate, instructional designer with TWG, hopeful about local elections in Minneapolis, reside on Dakota land in Minneapolis. Thank you for that. Paul, entering with sadness, especially for my teenage child who had to experience loss of hope. Paul, I appreciate you lifting that up. At some point, all of us in this Zoom space will be ancestors. We'll be in some form of ancestral realm. And I too am a mother of 2 adult sons and thinking about the land, the world that they are inheriting from us. So I really appreciate you lifting that up. Thank you for this. Happy to be blue in Illinois, but pissed for my sis in Georgia. Thank you, Camille. Thank you. Thank you so much. Can we just have a collective breath? That's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah. Thinking about our journey and the time that we're together today, we'll be talking some about the foundations of public policy and power and current events. We've talked about this, I'm sure many of us in smaller circles and those of us who are practitioners in this space. It is impossible to have these conversations without the context of power. Without the context of power. We'll be, to the point that several people lifted up, we'll be discussing some of the themes, some of the insights, what Lee and I have been tracking surrounding the resistance to equity and justice. And what can we do? What can we do at all levels of system? What can we do on an interpersonal level, on an intrapersonal level, institutional and structural level? And how might that show up in your own work? And more importantly, in your own individual day-to-day lives? And then identify where we have influence and where there might be opportunity for collaboration, collective activism, action, radical agitation, agitate in this space. Want to lift up, before we move any further, what we like to call session commitments, the way that we invite you to be with one another and the way that we commit to being with you, centering the experiences of those most impacted. In some ways, those most impacted, and I'm not suggesting at all that those of us in this room are not impacted, but by sheer virtue of the fact that we all have access to technology to be here, we are privileged, right? So thinking about those folks who are most impacted by the decisions that were made last night and the decisions and the public policy that will come out of the lawmakers who were elected into office, choosing curiosity over judgment. I make no assumptions about where all 68 of us in this room fall on the spectrum of what is important to us. And so choosing curiosity particularly if you are discomforted, modeling authenticity and vulnerability. Y'all been doing that so beautifully already. In that spirit, if there's something you want to share, that you're not quite comfortable sharing publicly, you can send me a private message and I will honor anonymity and amplify your voice. Recognizing the limitations of our own lens. I'm so appreciative for all of the varied, beautiful, wide range of identity that everyone dropped in as much as we may be well-titled, well-educated, well-traveled, well-versed, well-intentioned, we are still coming from the limited perspective that is our own. And finally, recognizing that intent and impact are not always congruent. And if we cause harm, because this work, we know it's messy, it's challenging, there are always missteps. I'm learning every day and growing in this work, that we honor the impact that we have on others by show of hands, real or virtual, head nod, or whatever other way you want to signal agreement. Can we come to agreement on these commitments? And also, is there anything else that's important? Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Sid. Anything else? Another way of being. Yeah, Lynette, democracy only happens when we all participate. I'm keeping on. Happy for the first. Yep, Wes Moore. I first became aware of his work, the book, The Other Wes Moore, when he wrote that brilliant piece following another Wes Moore who had had a very different trajectory, who had been imprisoned. And so if you are unfamiliar with that book, I offer that. Thank you so much. Would someone bring voice into room and read The Brilliance of James Baldwin? Would someone just bring their voice in the room and read this aloud for all of us?
I will. This is Tanya Bowers, she and her. We can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist.
Tanya, thank you for that. What comes up for you all? We can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Thinking about this specific to our most recent elections and all that's been happening, all of the resistance in our space, in our sector. What comes up? I invite you to bring voice into room. What resonates? Yes, please, Naisha.
Hi there, Anisha Fredericks, she, her, and hers pronouns. I think this, it really strikes me and reminds me of all of the attempts I had to have discussions with people around why, what's happening in the world right now, and, you know, some of the pain that was caused by our past presidents and president, and why, you know, like, what does that mean in the long term and the impact in our lives? And I would always get this, well, we can agree to disagree. And that's just what that reminded me of. And it was like, no, actually we can't. Like, I can't afford to agree to or to disagree, you know, with you, because I'm the mother of sons. I'm the mother of Black males, and their lives are always hanging in the balance. You know, as long as you continue to act as if, because this doesn't impact you directly, it's not a social issue that we need to deal with, a justice issue that we all need to deal with. You know, you either pay now or you pay later. And so that's what came to me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be so long-winded.
No apologies for your brilliance and bringing voice in this space. I appreciate you lifting up and sharing that as the mother of Black sons, and that denial of humanity wasn't that long ago that the 3/5 clause was in full force in the United States of America, right? It was in play until post-Civil War. So yeah, humanity. Anyone else? What comes up for you? What resonates?
My name is Michelle, and she, her. I can't understand or accept that this doesn't make perfect sense for everyone. And I know that's naive and idealistic, and I don't, and yet, yeah, I just, it just is right. And I don't want to be like, I'm right and they're not, but this is so all encompassing and comprehensive of respect for everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Hannah, I see what you dropped in. Principled disagreement is essential in movement building, elevates creativity and increases pathways forward towards collective liberation. I love the phrase of collective liberation because I'm always thinking, Hannah, that there is shared and collective oppression, which always means then there is shared and collective liberation. So I appreciate you bringing that in. Yeah. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Lee, any other hands up? I just want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Anyone want to bring voice into room?
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
I have a hand up.
Oh, Keith, hi. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. It's two thoughts. One, it strikes me that this conversation actually follows a whole series of things that have happened, including Dobbs and other kind of voter suppression efforts across the country. And what it seems to me is that these legal systems, all the way up to the Supreme Court, reifies the very thing that critical race theory speaks to. And we are seeing it play out in very, very explicit ways and in very problematic ways. And then the second thing that that bothers me quite a bit is this notion of false equivalence, where there's this criticism of both sides, like a pox on both of your houses, when in fact I think that is false equivalence, because on one side you have people who are violently trying to overthrow the government process. We have people who are denying climate change, and so a whole series of things. And I just don't think that whatever the limitations or deficiencies are on the part of more progressively minded folks, that it's not the same at all to think about the movement on the other side for arch conservatives and sometimes violent conservatives.
Thank you so much for that, Keith. And I appreciate you bringing that in, because that language, not that the concept is new, but that specific language is relatively new in terms of media. And we're going to talk in a bit about distrust of media and how information is being disseminated. But that specific language has been in our sphere, in our realm for the last couple of years, and regurgitated over and over again and used as party lines. So I do appreciate you bringing that in. Thank you, Keith. My husband and I, this is a private message, and I are on opposite political ends. What I've tried to share with him is that we can disagree on our beliefs on key issues, but I can't agree to disagree with the fact that he feels his religious beliefs should impact how others live. I respect that we can all believe different things for how we individually live our lives, but not how we treat others. I want to hold space for the complexity of that type of relationship. And I'm talking about the familial, intimate relationships where we might be not just on opposing sides of an issue, but opposing sides that could kill us, right? Cause us death, depending on where we hold belief and where we hold identity. Want to lift up, and Keith, you also said something, I don't want to make assumptions about where everyone is, but the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Org, that was that landmark decision, U.S. Supreme Court, the court held that the Constitution of the United States does not confer a right to abortion. So just want to lift up to make sure everyone's, I'm checking chat. Are we missing anything? Yeah, Darla, I always try to diffuse politics by saying it's not a binary, it's more complicated than that. Yeah, Darla, and and then explaining to folks what binary is, right? I mean, you gotta get people on kind of the same page around what that even means, because there is that level of polarization. Thank you for that. When we think about public policy, thank you, Thamra. I find it really difficult to hold space these days for people with opposing political beliefs, because it is about values, and the values are oppressive. Yeah, Thamra, that resonates with me and in my personal life. And then I think about the compartmentalization of my professional space, where that is what I am called to do, right? Because if I'm using I statements, not, I then am feeling that if I'm not holding space, there's no chance of helping people move along or understand another perspective or come to some empathy. So I feel conflicted in that way too, as a practitioner in this space. Yeah. Conservative wokeism is a profound concern. The animating role of social media is a profound concern. So when we think about public policy, and oftentimes, and Lee and I were having some intense conversations about this, I've been involved in voter registration and marching and voters' rights since I feel as though I came into this world right out of the womb into this work. And oftentimes in the spaces I'm in, particularly in the corporate work that I do in this space, people are thinking about the folks I'm interacting with and engaging. Public policy is something that looms really large, like on a federal level. And going back to levels of systems, you know, local public policy, state, national, international, and public policy debates often focus on major decisions. That came up, someone lifted up the president that created so much of this vitriol and dangerous rhetoric. It's always been here. This is America we've always been, right? I mean, this is how we were founded. We are only here as either descendants of indigenous folk, descendants of enslaved folk, or descendants of immigrants. That's all we got in this nation, in the United States of America. So we have a torrid history. And curious, how do you think about public policy? How does that show up in your work? How is that showing up in your life? Tammy, I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate you lifting that up. It's interesting because I as my Chevara Black girl self, I show up as one way, and then I still find myself in the conflict as a practitioner. So I appreciate you lifting that up. So how are you all thinking about public policy? How does it show up for you in your work and in your life? Please bring voice into room.
I'm seeing in the chat, Hannah shared, every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. And someone else followed up, we keep trying to work within systems that are not designed to work for us. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lee. Any response to that from our collective?
I just want to add, I mean, I feel like it's frustrating. It makes me want to hit my head against the wall. I mean, yesterday was a perfect example. There's still going to be people who are going to challenge the results of yesterday. And, you know, we've got, I stopped looking at all the poll results, but I'm frustrated that in Georgia, where Warnock is the clear winner, we're going to go into a runoff. And so it's feeling, right now, it's just feeling disempowered because we're supposed to be able to make change and affect change, right, as individual citizens. But in some ways, I feel like really we're just powerless and this is all a facade. I don't know. It's how I feel right now.
Leah, thank you for that. No, thank you for that. Osvaldo, as the first Latino elected school board member of Oregon's second largest school district, after 1 year and served as board chair, there is an active recall effort against my equity and diversity framework. Half the community wants to return to traditional American education, in quotes, remove genderqueer and stamped for kids books from our schools. I'm staying strong, but also disappointed from these hateful, racist, and discriminating actions and viewpoints. Thank you for that. Thank you for your work.
For me, I think what this is showing us is that public policy impacts us at the most granular levels in the most day-to-day ways that oftentimes I think we just can't put our arms around because we are, you know, busy with whatever we're doing each day. However, I think what's been amplified now with the polarization and with what's happening with school boards and whatnot, because many of us, me included, I might not have paid that much attention to school board, election, but now I think we're recognizing, at least I speak for me, I am recognizing, the interconnection of all of this and how it impacts. And the other thing is that there's so much policy going on and things being legislated, that we don't know about, that are behind the scenes and just happening right in municipalities and locations and counties, and all of that is coming together now to create this perfect storm in terms of where we are. And this has been happening over the years. I mean, this is not something that just it's not 4 years ago, 8 years ago. And for some, we believe it happened starting with the election of President Obama and that coalition that decided this is not going to ever happen again. And so this has been going on, this where we are now politically, and we just have to be woke. Even though DeSantis said we're going to cut that wokeness out, but for me, it's just really paying attention to the details, paying attention to the little things that seem little, but will then snowball into something big.
Yeah, Mary Frances, I appreciate you lifting up, from a granular level to the international influence that our public policy has, right? So what you just shared made me think about a couple of things. A few months ago, I was in Iceland. I was on a feminist walking tour, and the sociologist that I was with, she said, we have had long-held policy and perspective in support of the LGBTQ plus community. She was talking about the fact that when she was a little girl, as a 10-year-old, she had always seen a woman holding office as president. So there's been some real progress. And at the same time, Iceland has its own issues around white supremacy. So I'm, holding space for all of that. One of the things she said, though, that I thought was particularly interesting to me is she said that the language of turf, the war is the language she used against the transgender community. She said, we weren't having that until you all started doing this in the US and the UK. She said, all of that hatred spilled over from the UK and the US into Iceland. And then I'm also thinking about, Mary Frances lifting up that it has always been this way. I was in a client session recently and invited them to bring in cultural artifacts. That could be anything that was connected to how they think about culture. And what I shared was my great-grandfather's declaration of intention to become a citizen of the United States of America. He immigrated from Kiev, Russia, and there are two of them, one from 1904 and one from 1920, talking about public policy, right? Like what we had stamped in policy. And at the beginning of it, it's interesting because it's his name, Samuel Vretsky, which they later changed to Orrin, the name that I use to avoid anti-Semitism and further persecution as Jews in the United States. It asks color, and he has white. And then it asks complexion, complexion, and there's a blank. Then there's another part down that is also curious. It says, I renounce forever any allegiance to any potentate, state, anyone else other than the United States of America. And at the bottom of it, I am not an anarchist, nor a polygamist, nor believe in the practice of polygamy. So help me God, basically. So thinking about how in 1902 and 1904 and 1920, public policy, we still have very racist immigration policies, but built in and baked in to our documents. We wanted to know what complexion people were coming into this nation, and we know why. We know what complexions are desirable in this nation. So again, thinking about the long-held practice and policies that have always been inside of this nation. Tamara, I appreciate you lifting this up. What is tradition has been something I've been thinking about. Tradition in the US is whiteness. Kendra, decision-making of clients made with a sense of urgency and lack of reflection and inclusion that reinforces and continues to perpetuate inequities. So when we think about our public policy, not just sweeping across our nation, but the impact, going back to impact that we have across the world, the environment, reproductive rights, which of course has been front and center in recent weeks, education and curriculum for many of the states that you all are coming from. Certainly here, we too are having bans in the state of Florida around books and information that we can share, curriculum. Any other, thinking about public policy and concerns specific to you in your community, in your neighborhood, in your state, what other public policy concerns are important?
May I? I'm not sure if this is as personal a response as you're asking, but I was reading an article this morning, the risky road ahead, employment law implications of Dobbs, and for organizations that are focusing on issues around equity. What does equity really look like in the context of a post-Dobbs organizational context? And in the article talks about the implications for employee health benefits and what the issues and difficulties and challenges are in enforcing the new Supreme Court mandate? What does it mean in terms of existing laws like the Pregnancy Discrimination Act? And how this now can turn that upside down in some ways? What does it mean in terms of privacy? And we know that in Texas, for example, now that you have criminal exposure, that in some cases organizations can face the possible criminal prosecution. There was a law firm that had offices in Texas, and it was threatened by a conservative group with having their members disbarred for having their employees in Texas either given access or given resources to have abortions. So the policy level issues are just massive and massively problematic.
Yeah, Keith, I'm so glad you lifted that up. That's actually, we're going to talk about it. We'll talk about it now. We're going to talk about it in a moment, but I think that's so important. What Keith lifts up, when that decision came across the Supreme Court, immediately within hours, corporations across this nation were making statements, right? If you live in a state and work for us, we will provide reimbursement. And initially, everyone, and Keith, to the point you were just making, were applauding that. Like, this is so progressive. This is the first time I can say in my lifetime that I have seen corporations responding in this way. No surprise, because this is the world that we now live in. And I remember the first thing I was thinking was, wow, they're talking about reimbursement as if people are going to have resources and access to abortion in the first place. I have 2 sons. I've also had several abortions. And I think about the cost and the cost to travel across state and the human companionship that you would need to even go through. So I couldn't have done that by myself. I couldn't have afforded it by myself. And so I was thinking about that, but you're right. When we think about the persecution then of these corporations and everything else, the Pandora's box almost that it opens up, not just around DOMS, but around other policies that organizations, corporations, institutions are going to be forced to take a stand on. Going to be forced to take a stand on. So thank you for lifting that up. Megan, we just had a measure on the ballot in Illinois to protect the right to unionize. As you can imagine, it was hotly contested. Unionizing is always hotly contested by those who hold the most power. Amendment on the ballot in Louisiana to ban slavery from our Constitution except for penal labor. Lynette, there were several states that was the headlines today, that they are for the first time removing the language of slavery from the Constitution as punishment for crime. I saw that in several states. So thank you for lifting that up. Anyone else? Vermont. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for that. Locally, the focus at my organization right now is how we in DEI can support our leaders in having or holding space for difficult conversations around public policy issues with their teams. Yeah, Leah, we've been engaged in a lot of that too. And there's a study that we're going to share in just a few moments that really does speak to why it's not only critical, but mandatory for organizations to be thinking about public policy and leveraging their power, because the heads of these institutions, corporations, large NGOs, all of them, they're not just at the helm of their organizations. They are on boards across the nation, right? They serve on board of trustees at universities. They are the leaders at the Chamber of Commerce. So they also have power in other places that absolutely impact policy. And it's interesting, Lee and I were just talking about this a couple of days ago, in as much as these organizations will say, well, we really don't want to get involved. Many of them have had lobbyists for decades, post 1970. So they've been involved. They've been heavily involved when it benefits them, when we think about capitalism. And yeah, I address this with several clients. Employees don't have the resources to travel and be reimbursed, and org leaders, HR are not equipped to support employees needing support in these situations. Huge skill and potential impact gap. Absolutely, Sarah, great intention, but not having all the perspective of voices around the table. And then going back to something that that was just lifted up, when we think about privacy, I can't even imagine having to submit into some system in HR that I need a pregnancy termination, to have that information out there in whatever sphere it is. So yeah, thank you for that. Thank you so much for that, Keith. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for dropping that in. I lifted up power a moment ago and said that there's no possible way to have these conversations, not in our realm, without talking about power. And when we think about the way that power shows up in your role, within your own organization, within your own community, the ability to direct and influence our social group identities. Lee and I lifted that up when we were introducing ourselves, access and inherited privileges that we might have as white, as able-bodied, as cisgendered, as formally educated, whatever that looks like. And then gifts and agency, this intrinsic source of strength. But when we think about our work, the work that we're doing now, the work that's on the horizon, these first two definitions of power are what I'd like us to focus on. And there's some very interesting research around power by Dr. Sukhvinder Obi. Dr. Obi found that power changes the way the brain responds to others, and that those who hold the most power are more likely to stereotype, less likely to be empathetic to the powerless. I think about race and gender often when I think about this body of work, because those with power are less likely to listen to the perspectives of the less powerful, right? Not paying attention to individuating information. I think as a Black woman in this world, I've always had to I feel as though I've had to know more about men and white people to navigate safely my own survival in this world. And so thinking about it from that perspective, curious how power shows up for you within your institutions, within your own sphere. How do you talk about power in your work? Sarah, yeah, the addition of Gibson's agency gets lost so often in conversations. It's a good reminder, right? Let's call it reminder that there are many ways for us to think about and reimagine power. How is power showing up? Are you talking about the redistribution of power with the organizations with whom you're working within your own organizations? Allison, power is never directly discussed. It's subtly practiced and tacitly enforced. Yeah. Anyone else? I'd like to reimagine a world where grassroots are on the ground is the default leadership approach, the norm. Thank you for that, Tamara. Yes.
Sid has raised hand.
Hi, Sid. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say that the way that we've been talking about power is in a number of different ways. So the different types of power that show up, not just like legitimized power that our leadership has, but referent power of like being well liked, or if you are a subject matter expert, and making sure that we're lifting up and acknowledging those types of power so other folks can see themselves in more powerful positions and know that what they are bringing to the table in those forums is really valued. And that's been an education with our leadership, and then sharing that out with our organization to make sure folks can see themselves in different positions of power and not just designate themselves with less because of their maybe formal title.
Yeah, Sid, I so appreciate you bringing in, there are different types of power, right? We've got legitimate power, which you referenced. We've got reward power, expert power, referent power, coercive power. I talk about power dynamic in most of my training work with clients, particularly in talking through anti-harassment related topics. Always surprised at how little people understand power and its impact on the ways we work. Yeah, Sarah, I think the word power in and of itself makes folks cringe, I find sometimes in spaces. It's not a comfortable conversation, almost as though it's a dirty P word. People get very tense and defensive. We've introduced the impact of power in DEI training. Thanks to the Winters Group, HR also talks about power in harassment and discrimination training. Camille's, would you drop that into Camille's question, Dr. Sukhvinder Obi's work? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely, the word is weaponized. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Power is being given to the detractors by backing away from challenging or difficult topics at the expense of those communities that this work is intended to empower. Thank you, Anisha. Thanks for dropping that in, Lee. Invite you to think about this statement. Would someone read this aloud? Love to hear, welcome the voice of someone we haven't heard from.
I'll read. Public policy drives individual rage.
Yeah, read it one more time, please.
Public policy drives individual rage.
Yeah. Invite you, yeah, public policy drives individual rage. We are seeing that, aren't we, across this nation? Our insurrection. There's a wonderful book by Dr. Carol Anderson out of Emory University. She talks about white rage. She says white rage is in response to like Black excellence, Black progress, where rage comes from. Tammy, yeah, why I'm hesitant to get excited about first people in positions of power as relates to other BIPOC folks. All skin folk ain't kin folk, right, Tammy? Just because they are the first does not mean they are aligned with liberation or speaking truth to power, even in DEI spaces. I think that's important to lift up, Tammy, because it makes me think about a deeper conversation that could and should and is being had in our space around internalized oppression. I think about spaces where folks have talked about a glass or concrete ceiling and needing more women around the proverbial table. And then you get more people who identify as women or female around a proverbial table. And someone poses the question, why is it still so patriarchal here? Why is there so much misogyny? Because women folk can perpetuate the patriarchy. Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think it's important to think about the power shifts, real or perceived, and the reaction to that as more people now have access to flexible work schedules and remote work. Yeah, Deonta, and who's not being privileged in those spaces too, right? And the incredible access. I think about for 3 decades, folks from the differently able, disabled community have been saying, remote work, please. And corporations, institutions' response has been, oh, no, it'll be too costly, too disruptive. One pandemic later, we've got remote work. Yeah, thank you for that. We're going to watch a short video. And many of us familiar with this, if you were raised in the United States and had access to a television. We had a television that didn't work and it had like a weird metal, I grew up in abject poverty, y'all. And so there was a wire hanger on the top of it. And so we got snow. So I used to watch this at my next door neighbor's house because it never came on my television screen. But many of us familiar with this, either in school or growing up, watching or having access to television, learning about how our government works. And it's an old video, so in as much as things have changed, they remain the same. But I'd like you, as you're watching, to take some notes, take them as a journal prompt for yourself, or you could certainly drop them in chat. What comes up for you? And then we'll hear from a few folks after we watch the video.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. How I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm gonna live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be along. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
Thoughts. You know, that was 1976. 1976, a jazz singer, and the voice of the little boy was actually his real life son. There was a parody that SNL did in 2014 that's much edgier. And it was interesting for me seeing that revision of this. Yeah. What stands out? Not just about that video, but in terms of where we are. Yeah, Tammy. You know, the 117th Congress, those folks who took office in 2021, the most racially and ethnically diverse ever that we've had in our nation. 23% of Congress identifying as Black, Hispanic, Asian Pacific, Islander, or Native American. 26% of the House of Representatives and 11% of the Senate. Just for some current data. Yeah, absolutely. Rafaela, we're still behind in representation. Seems to illustrate bureaucracy as just the way things are without acknowledging that things can change. This process was chosen by humans and can be changed by humans. Nothing about the influence of lobbyists, money, corporations. Absolutely. Lee and I were talking about this and I said, wow, the naivete I had as a 10-year-old watching this and thinking that this is the way things will happen. And that's so important to lift up. Lobbyists, money, corporations. Visually, it represented white people, white children as part of the process of government. Yeah. What else did you notice? It's good that potential bills get discussed in committee and that theoretically is inclusion, but we know there are many problems, money influences. Yep, absolutely. So much bureaucracy, inefficiency in the process. Absolutely, Andrea, much more calculated than this. Yeah. No female Congress people and all depicted were white. No hearing from the community. Yeah. Different eyes, different viewpoint looking at this now, perhaps for some of us who haven't seen it in several decades. How do we get more people to vote and to participate? Rafaela Reyes, that's a great question. Stacey Abrams has certainly created a blueprint for that. When I think about the extraordinary work that she's done in Georgia, galvanizing folks to vote. You know, yesterday was so sobering. I went to vote and what was heavy on my heart is a dear friend of mine. She's actually done a podcast with the Winters Group. Her name is Claudia Shivers, a dear friend of mine from North Carolina, and she spent a year in prison and was released early during the pandemic because they couldn't keep the women safe at the prison where she was incarcerated. And one of our former colleagues, Brittany J. Harris, and I did a really powerful talk with Claudia after she was released early. She has an incredible company called Queen Coffee Bean, which was an idea before she was going into prison. And she called me the day that she was turning herself in. And I said, journal everything. This is part of your story. And write that business plan. And so she wrote that business plan, she journaled, and she ended up on an ABC network show about people who are re-entering. And yesterday morning, Claudia called me and she said, hey girl, I'm gonna take some Queen coffee bean down to my local, one of my precincts, and my daughters, she has 5 children, my daughters are gonna wear Queen coffee bean shirts, and we're gonna pass out coffee because I still can't vote. And y'all, it like stabbed me in my gut. Stabbed me. I fell apart. And so when I went to vote, I wasn't just voting for me and my children and my community. I was voting for Claudia, because Claudia can't vote. And she's always voted. We voted together in North Carolina. We worked the polls together. And that just felt real heavy for me, thinking about, yeah. Mary Frances, there was some talk years ago about the need for a constitutional convention to change some of this process to be more relevant to today's reality. So many good bills, and other people, yeah, like Merrick Garland, never even make it to the floor for a vote. We all watched that process play out in front of our eyes a couple of years ago. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks for dropping that in, Aaliyah. I mentioned a moment ago that we were going to lift up this study. I've been following the Edelman Trust Barometer. Folks familiar with it in the space? If not, they've been doing this for about 2 decades now. So Edelman puts out this trust barometer every year. And this year, what the survey, and they survey, it's across 28 countries. So this is, international in scope, about 36,000 respondents. And what they discovered this year is that media and government are the least trusted entities in all of the world. And businesses are being held to a different standard of being the source of information, and also leaders of these institutions, corporations, are being held accountable differently. I was thinking about it in the context of after the heinous murder of George Floyd and the pandemic, that employee activism was at an all-time high. We saw conscious consumerism in a way that we've not seen before, and then stakeholder solidarity. So I was thinking about the intersection of that and this work from Edelman. And even though they said, the respondents said, we're looking to institutions, corporations to be kind of this voice, they also, the respondents say, institutions aren't doing nearly enough to address the existential challenges, pandemic response, climate change, social justice issues, and that trust overall has fallen in democracies. And some of these societal fears that which is what some of you all talked about when I was asking you, how are you entering this space? Job loss, climate change, loss of freedoms, freedom stolen, taken away, not loss of freedoms. I think that's not an apt descriptor. This cycle of distrust fueled by division and disinformation. They said it's threatening our social stability. So just want to lift up some of the ways that this is showing up. Systemic injustices and access to healthcare, 2 of the issues that the respondents said businesses aren't doing nearly enough, and that people are holding businesses responsible for, too. About this, Lee and I were talking about this in the context of just this week, news about Twitter. And we saw this morning, Twitter's and Meta laying off 13% of its workforce, the way that so many of us get information across this world, not just in these United States, but through social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and how this is showing up. And how it's also being weaponized, how information is being weaponized, thoughts, responses. Yeah, Aaliyah, it's illegal in Georgia to give food and water to voters in line. Yeah. Here, I live in Florida, and it's been criminalized to provide food to people experiencing homelessness here. You can be fined and arrested if an officer so chooses to. In parks, I live downtown, and so I've had several run-ins with officers around. It's hot in Florida. I keep water in my vehicle, so yeah, that resonates. Yeah, incredibly dehumanizing. I grew up standing in welfare and food stamp lines, so I was a person who needed those resources. I needed people to connect with my humanity in that way. Stephen, thank you for that. Voting for a DACA friend. Yeah. Any thoughts? What's coming up for you? What's resonating?
I actually just wanted to comment on this. I was reading this morning about what's happening at Twitter and how some of the guardrails to prevent this disinformation are being removed by the new owner, and how he has actually used the platform yesterday to encourage Twitter users to vote Republican. And it just made me realize just how much power, right, folks have, like him and Mark Zuckerberg and others who own these giant social media platforms, and what that means for all of us, right? And it's scary. It's just really, really scary.
No, I appreciate you lifting that up, and just shout out to Mary Frances and the Winters group too for taking a stand on Twitter, because what happened right after that ownership shift finally happened, because this has been in the works for a while, we've been reading about this for months, is the level of vitriol exponentially skyrocketed 500% in some cases with some of the language that's being used on that platform, and the real threat to folks' lives. Yeah.
My just to kind of piggyback off what Aaliyah said, my wife actually she left Twitter right before this all happened. She luckily had the foresight to get out, but it's really, she was a researcher, and her entire research team was gone. They were all fired. And she was just so frustrated because most of her research was around this blue check mark verification thing, and how the blue check mark, like it doesn't, you don't pay for it. You don't pay to elevate your status, but you don't have to, now you have to prove, like with the photo ID, and your photo ID might not match your gender identity, and all these different ways where it's discriminatory and elevates the wrong voices. So like Elon Musk, a very rich, privileged white man's voice is the loudest voice that we're hearing everywhere. His voice is screaming from every news outlet, and it's exhausting. And the part of her research was like trying to elevate not his voice. And he just is, wants to make money, and that's how he's choosing to make money. But it's just so frustrating that all of the Twitter being a platform that everyone's voice can be elevated, and right now everyone but his voice is being suppressed, and it's very sad.
Rhea, thank you, one, for sharing that with such vulnerability and giving us some insight. It's interesting because we were just talking about power, the fact that even in our world, in our nation, an individual could be the sole owner of an entire social media platform. So when we think about public policy and what regulatory measures need to be in place, and why the vote is so critically important, here in my state, in addition to voting for our governor, what mostly took up our ballot were the reinstatement of judges. Now, most people have no idea what's going on with judges. Y'all know what I did this was right before the pandemic. I had some time on my hands. I mean, not really time on my hands, but I carved out some time on my hands, and I would go sit in judges' chambers, y'all, in family court, and take notes. I sit for hours. The first barrier that I had is I walk in, and this is a true story. This was 2 years ago. I walk in, and I feel like I'm dressed appropriately to be in somebody's courtroom, like I'm in a business attire, because I thought I might have some hassle. And so I get there and I say, because the door is shut and the guard is out front, and I say, "Hi, I'd like to come in and observe. Are you a lawyer?" "No, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a citizen." "Are you a law student?" Not a law student. I'm exercising my right as a citizen of Broward County to sit inside this courtroom and find out what my judges are doing. I had to get security to get me into judges' chambers, y'all, to sit and simply observe. And I took a journal because, you can't record. So I took a journal, and I was journaling. When the pandemic happened and Zoom happened, it was easier because I could sit in the comfort of my home and just sit in all these judges' chambers. And I was making a list and documenting all of the inequity, the racism, the sexism, the xenophobia that I saw as judges were making rulings. Most citizens don't have that kind of time. It's very time consuming to sit in there and do that. But and I'm just sharing that with you because from an individual perspective, an interpersonal, level of system, I chose to insert myself in the process so I could be more informed as a voter and hold them accountable, because behind closed doors, no one has any idea. And the judges across this nation are the ones who are setting this public policy. So just offering that as one way that we can kind of infiltrate the system. Let me go back to that for a second. This is the data around government and media. And thank you. I saw in chat, I don't see it now because it disappeared. Cheryl, I voted no for all except one. Cheryl, yes. I voted no for all except two. For all except two. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's very difficult to research judges. It's right. Even as a court watcher, it's so hard to get information. And that is one place where when I think about our sector, how powerful it would be. And New York had one. I haven't found it now in a few years, but a data system where people could go in, kind of like on, you know how on TripAdvisor, people go in and they like write up reports, something like that, that would be nationwide, that would be a monitoring system where in real time, you know what's happening with these judges. I mean, I think that's one way that our sector could actually be involved. Yeah, try sitting in DV court and watch how Black women are treated in court. Davida, thank you for that. Absolutely. Thank you for that. You know, when we were talking about, Lee and I were talking about the ways right now, resistance to our work is showing up. It's showing up framing progress from marginalized groups as attacks on the rights of others. It's chilling when I think about my state. And when I heard this last night, I don't know if anyone saw the video of Governor DeSantis, but he begins by saying, freedom is here to stay. We have rewritten the political map, he says. We fight the woke in the legislature. We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in the corporations. Florida, he says, is where the woke goes to die. That was his speech last night. Framing progress for marginalized groups as attacks on the rights of others. Voter suppression, gerrymandering, lobbying, rejection of valid election results. I dared question yesterday when I was voting if there was a restroom. I got to my polling place, y'all, yesterday with my voter registration card and my ID, and I got there and they told me that my polling place had been shifted and I was in the wrong place. This is where I've been voting for 5 years. Turns out it's closer to where I live, but that's not the point. What if I was on a bus line? What if I was walking? What if my job had given me a limited time? So I get to the new polling space, which is actually City Hall, and I work out every morning. I'd had about 2 gallons worth of water. I was like, I need to use a restroom. Is there one here? Woman says, no, there's not. I said, really? What about folks like me who just need to use the restroom, elder people, people with children? I start naming all these people. And then I ask, and by the way, the parking in the deck, is somebody waiving the fee here today? It was a battle, y'all, with the clerk yesterday. And I was simply raising up issues, not that even impacted me around parking, but that would further disenfranchise or dissuade people from being able to vote in this particular precinct, which also happened to be City Hall. So when we think about how voter suppression shows up, it shows up in a wide range of ways. My friend's polling place was switched from the elementary school to the local hate church. Thank you for that, Megan. Censoring curriculum about oppression throughout history and media. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment when I share with you what I've been doing, the work I've been doing around the Stop Woke Act here in our state. Legislation restricting humanity and promoting fear, criminalizing gender-affirming care, bathroom bills, and trans athlete legislation, the Stop Woke and the Don't Say Gay, specifically here in Florida. How else is resistance showing up? How are you seeing resistance show up in your state, in your communities, with the organizations with whom you work?
I'm having a hard time raising my hand.
Oh, no,
Sorry.
that's okay. Just bring your voice in. It's okay.
If you don't mind, I would like to share a local race that just that was occurring here, and it was for the school board. And I live in a county where there's multiple districts within the same school board. So this particular race didn't affect me, but I certainly got behind it because one of the folks that was running to be on the school board who wants to ensure that critical race theory is not taught in school, and was also a participant on January 6th, homeschools her children, so doesn't even participate in any public school education whatsoever. You know, like that type of silencing was what was occurring. And thankfully, there was a lot of disappointment for the state of North Carolina, but thankfully, she was sent home. So that made me happy, because it's that kind of, you know, that it's those local opportunities to, you know, that kind of, you know, it could stop a potential DeSantis one day in their tracks if we shut them down at that local level. But, you know, it's sort of off topic, but kind of on topic. I just think that we just, you know, we need to make sure we're paying attention to what's happening at that local level, because they sneak right past us and end up with the story you just shared.
Yeah,
and
no,
the pain of what's happening
yeah.
in Florida.
Yeah, no, Naisha, you're absolutely right. And I think that that's why, in as much as those of us who are in this space, this DEIJ space, always lifting up these levels of system, it's so important to be always thinking about not just how the oppression is showing up, but how we do this work, how we disrupt, dismantle, and reimagine. Because language matters. When we vilify, when we demonize, when we criminalize progress, we are fostering this culture that enables assault to happen against those who are most vulnerable. Yes, Keith, I see your hand. Oh, you're on mute still.
In that same magazine that I mentioned earlier, there's another article. Where does religious freedom end and discrimination against marginalized groups begin? The U.S. Supreme Court appears to be leaning toward an expanded view of religious freedom at the expense of the LGBTQ plus community, marginalized genders, religious minorities, and other disenfranchised groups.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
There you have it, which goes back to that goes back to Baldwin. I mean, right? When we talk about where that line is, the moment this becomes this rhetoric becomes oppressive theory, practice, and policy. Thank you for that. Thamara, resistance is showing up in my pretty progressive neighborhood with the new rise in mixed housing, apartments, townhomes, and a predominantly single family home area. People are against it, claiming that it ruins the beauty and peace of the neighborhood. Whose beauty, whose peace, right? Whose value do we value is the question. Underneath that is the assumptions of what kind of people would be inhabiting these new apartments and townhomes. Hannah, local community conflating safety with the police, despite a recent community safety review that included research that confirmed the police's harm on the most marginalized community members. There are still calls for more police and more surveillance. Yeah, thank you for that. We're experiencing something similar as our own town increases the public bus routes. Thank you, Sarah. In DEI work, I found that a passive resistance is manifested in filibustering diversity issues, thus no progress on issues that matter. Allison, thank you for that. The attack on awake or woke is an invisible boogeyman used to stoke fear among their base. They do the same thing with CRT, which no one even knew about except in the far depths of law schools, right, prior to last year. Absolutely, right. You ask them, what is it? Well, I don't know, but we definitely don't want it taught. We got to stop it. I don't know what it is, but let's stop it now. Tammy, it's hurtful to see how much people, even those who would consider themselves progressive, hate and have disdain towards people who rent versus those who own homes. Tammy, we have always criminalized poverty in this nation. Yeah. Adults aggressively attacking, doxing, and shouting at BIPOC youth at school board meetings and speaking against their needs within our schools, such as bilingual, bicultural mental health supports, culturally aware tutoring, BIPOC staff, and educators. Osvaldo, I have unfortunately seen across our nation videos like that where youth are showing up and standing up, right? And youth have always stood up. You think about the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade. You think about university and college campuses across this nation, union organizing, farm workers' rights. There have always been young people involved in our struggle for freedom. Poverty is a public, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Rhea, we observed Trans Day of Remembrance today. It was heartbreaking to hear of all the violence towards trans people, many who are under 18. Thank you for that. just want to lift up, because we're talking about, sorry about that. Talking about having a glitch over here with my technology. And someone said this earlier, we were talking about the loudest voice, right? That Elon Musk is the loudest voice on Twitter as owner, and the way that he is wielding his power. And when we think about in America, specific to America, the loudest voices are not even representing our majority. The Don't Say Gay bill that Governor DeSantis instated earlier this year, it comes at a time when a record 71% of Americans support same-sex marriage. Supreme Court on reproductive rights. Right now, the polls show that 61% of Americans believe that abortion should be accessible in all or most cases. And then gun control, the NRA and other lobbying has outsized influence. More than half of Americans surveyed recently indicated this past year that it's important for lawmakers to pass stricter gun laws. So it's really important that we think about creative, sustainable ways to move forward public policy that we as an American public, as a body politic, have said is important to us. Thinking about the identities that you all lifted up at the very beginning, when I asked, what informs, what's at your core? Thinking about your own identity, but for the lawmakers in your communities and for those representatives in your community, your lawmakers, your specific lawmakers, looking at this wheel, and it's nuanced, right? Because as the young folks say, there's levels to this. There's levels to this. It's not just a binary. And so if we're thinking about power, the closer we are to the center, the more power, more access that we have. So I'll just take skin color. Someone white, much closer to the core, the center of power. Someone like me, proximity to whiteness, white adjacent, kind of in the middle, and then folks with dark complexions on the outskirts, the outer edges, the most marginalized. And this is not an exhaustive list. We can think about neurodiversity. We can think about seniority within an organization, institution, or even seniority within your own family. And religion, depending on where you are in the world, what faith is most central, is most core, has the most dominance. But curious about the representatives in your community, where do they hold power? Where are their identities showing up on this power wheel? And does that make them more or less likely to be connected, to have empathy for the folks that they are representing? Deactivating Twitter. I hear you on that. Anyone else? That's a friendly reminder. That's just a little reminder to deactivate today. Deactivate today, if it's something that you can live without. It's possible, looking at this chart too, to hold privilege and be disadvantaged simultaneously, right? I hold privilege as someone who, thinking about body size, I don't struggle to fit in chairs or find clothing. I am 5'5" in stilettos, so sometimes I can't reach up high. But for the most part, the world smiles at me. No one is shuddering or in their mind wishing I don't sit next to them on an airplane. And at the same time, as a Black woman in this world, I don't hold a lot of privilege. I am formally educated. I am cisgendered. I am able-bodied. So the complexity of that dichotomy. Thank you, Tammy. One of the bastions where we have all kinds of hatred and rage that we don't discuss or try to dismantle. Thoughts around this, thinking about the representatives in your community, where they hold power using this wheel, and where might the disconnects be for the folks that they are responsible for and responsive to. Keith, was that you? Oh, I thought you were raising a hand. You were lifting up a taking a sip of water. So yeah. Lee, certainly want to invite your voice in.
Yeah, so I think what comes up for me in response to your question, so even though we just talked about the Congress, the previous Congress, is the most diverse that we have seen to date. I still think about the many ways that representation in the US and many other places fails to represent the people that it claims to. And I've really been reflecting on this locally for me. I am living in Philadelphia currently, and I know we talked about in the debate between John Fetterman and Dr. Oz, there was just a lot of really awfully ableist rhetoric that was swirling around Fetterman's performance in that debate. And we had a great conversation with our facilitators last week in just lifting up, it's really telling to show the ways that people are not understanding the value of potentially having someone who has a disability as a representative, as if there are not millions of Americans with disabilities who would be represented by that person and his experiences. And so for me locally, that's one that comes to mind. And I think it's just so critical that we continue to reflect about the ways that our representation does not capture the nuances and the intersections of the folks that they are serving.
Oh, yes, please bring your voice in. Yes.
Sorry, I was just going to jump on what Lisa. I think one thing though, too, not to like do any kind of flip siding, because I agree with everything we're saying, but I do think that we, like, I don't know, on the quote unquote woke left, like I struggle sometimes with some things that in the woke left brain, I have to be okay with. And like, I have to be transparent. Like, I, as a runner, as an athlete, like I struggle sometimes with transports. Like I'm really working hard to work through that, but I struggle, and I struggle sometimes with different sizes things. And I think that it's like this lump of like, oh, if you're on the left, you agree with, you have to be on the same page with every single thing. And I think we have to meet people where they are and acknowledge that we're not all at the same place. And like, we're all working, I hope we are, to be in a neutral ground place, but we're not all there. And I think it's definitely necessary for us to acknowledge that and not lump everyone in this, either you're woke or you're not category. I think that's where a lot of this division happens, if we don't all agree on the list of woke things that you have to agree on. And I think that's where I struggle with like my family and like thinking they should be exactly where I am. Like, why aren't you there? Like, be there. And that's not fair to them, and also alienates the conversation and them from me. So I think that's something I'm trying to be really aware of, and not putting the two sides, the two binaries, as strict one side or the other.
Yeah, Rhea, so much what you just shared was so nuanced and so layered. And yes. And I think, and you lifting up as an athlete and thinking about trans rights makes me think about Nancy Hogshead Makar, who is a 3-time gold medalist Olympian swimmer. She's also a civil rights attorney. She's been doing brilliant Title IX work her whole career. I created a We Are Straight Allies campaign a few years ago when I was living in North Florida that helped change policy in a city of 1 million people to expand protections for the LGBTQ community in housing, employment, and accommodations. It's a series of print ads, videos. I produced a documentary about a transgender woman, Denise Iandoli. And Nancy was one of the first people to join my campaign as a staunch supporter of LGBTQ plus rights. And at the same time, she firmly believes, because of the science, the biology, as someone who is an Olympian champion, that there is an unfair advantage tied to testosterone. And she has been vilified. I've known this woman for about a decade, and her track record as in solidarity is strong. And at the same time, she also comes from a perspective that I don't hold. I mean, I'm in the gym every morning, but I ain't been in nobody's Olympics, right? And so thinking about the science, thinking about her own lived experience, thinking about the work. So yes, I've seen that play out in my own small circle and with someone who I'm in solidarity, who I consider a comrade. And at the same time, it is possible for us to understand and hold perspective around liberation and oppression for certain areas of like the wokeness and not be there in other spaces. And I think it's important, absolutely important, that you lift it up. not only are we all on this journey is a continuum. It's not a straight line. This journey is a loop. There is evolution, there is devolution, there is all kinds of nuance. We have different lived experiences as we age, as we just have life happen to us and as we happen to life. So I really appreciate you lifting that up. Tammy, yes.
Thank you, sis. I just want to add that, and I think Allison mentioned this a little bit in the chat already, and put it like, as someone, and I've said this to my internal group, the Winners Group already, but like as someone who lives in a very, I call rare body, like at the intersections I exist in. So people who never met me before, never seen me in person. I'm 400 pounds. I'm 6'3". I'm a cishet woman, meaning like 1% of women in the world get tall as 6 feet, right? That's not just Black, and I'm a Black woman. So like I exist on these intersections, and one thing that came up in a session that really highlighted in my lived experience is I'm a billboard for people's insecurities when I enter space. And so as we and as practitioners of this Jedi work, where are some of the spots on this alignment that we may have internalized oppression and insecurity, and how might that show up when people who experience different parts on this intersection invoke that in us, right? And knowing like where that may show up. And it's interesting how I'm treated even in quote unquote woke spaces, because there's a conversation, there's an idea about, for instance, being fat, that it's a moral failing. My fatness is a moral failing, right? And so when I walk in spaces, I'm not just existing as a Black woman who is, who has the neurodiversity. I'm also constantly under surveillance my entire life, like quite literally, right? And so what I think about is how different people, even within the Jedi space, treat me, because they haven't sat thoroughly with the ways those intersections may antagonize an internalized oppression or insecurity. So there's that point. The second thing is, I would love for folks to check out the work of Fearing the Black Body and think about how our understanding of bodies, especially size and fatness and health, is obviously under the guise of like white supremacy, and it's been influenced by such. So what does it look like to decolonize our understanding of those things in the work that we do? Because oftentimes the way people either interact or dismiss is violent to me. And the way they read that is, it is okay to cause further harm or dismiss, and not even understand what they're doing is harmful, because this body can sustain more pain. We see that with Black motherhood, right? But even when you're not a mother, this body we see how we use harsher force verbally, physically, emotionally with people who are larger bodied, tall, Black, and do not fit a gender prescription. So thank you.
No, Tammy, thank you so much for lifting that up. And I think about the connection to public policy around health, to policy where folks, not just our police, but there are actual practices in place. I think about the airline industry. I mean, the policies they have around seat size, for example, when we know that as a demographic, and I'm talking about US, this is not the early 1900s where you go into a museum and all of the clothing looks like doll sized, right? We have larger bodied people, and we know that, like the demographics show that. So I'm thinking about the ways that what you just shared, and thank you so much for your vulnerability and how it's connected to a wide range of policies, public policy around health, around the medical community, the healthcare sector, biomedical sector. So thank you for lifting that up. And you also lift up something that ties into, when we think about public policy, who do our policies and our systems benefit? Who's harmed by systems? And how can we recreate, redistribute, reimagine the power that we talked about earlier to achieve equity specific to public policy across this nation, specific to public policy? So one of the things I'd like to lift up when we think about, Mary, right, they're announcing that they're making them smaller, right? And that's policy. that is policy. So then what does it mean for folks who fall, when we're looking at that wheel, who fall in those other categories, to add their voice in solidarity, to lift up, right? Or to invite the airline, are you making these policies? Who's around the proverbial table? Whose voices and perspectives? Do you have a wide range of body sizes making decision about this particular policy? You know, something that I think is really important, and I want to get into kind of the what, like what can be done. And these are such great examples. I think about Lucy McBath, who I've known for a while, met her when I lived in Jacksonville. She's the mother of Jordan Davis, and Ron Davis, Jordan's father, and I had become really good friends when I lived in Jacksonville, Florida, which is where Jordan was killed. He was the young man killed because the man at the gas station said the music was too loud. Lucy took her pain and her rage and she funneled it into running for office. And no surprise that the issue, the platform that she ran on, that she has been most impassioned about, is around combating gun violence. So here is a way. Rebecca Jones, not sure if folks remember here in Florida when the pandemic was at its peak, and Rebecca Jones dared create a dashboard because they were lying about the numbers. And the governor went after her with vengeance. He sent FBI into her home. They terrorized her children. They took all of her computers. She also decided to take that rage, that pain, and that frustration and say, you know what? I am going to become a lawmaker. I'm going to reimagine, redistribute this power so that we can have some effective policymakers, more just lawmakers in our midst. And more recently, some of you know this, some of you, this may be new information. After the Stop Woke Act happened in July 1 is when it took effect. And it was actually interesting. The Winters Group, we had a project the week before with a client who was so anxious to have me come do a keynote literally 3 days before the Stop Woke bill took effect, because they were worried that once it took effect July 1, I wouldn't be able to talk about any of the things that they needed me to talk about within their company. They were headquartered here in Florida. About 40% of their employee base was here in Florida. There was a group of folks from the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ACLU, and Protect Democracy, who had been working for several months on combating and filing a lawsuit against the governor. My sister, Bacardi, who's a brilliant labor and employment and civil rights lawyer, called me one day and she says, hey, Shay, she calls me Shay. She's like, hey, Shay, we had a meeting today and they were saying they really needed a DEI practitioner who lives in Florida and who has clients in Florida. And I said, hey, my sister is one of those. And then she quickly followed up with, although we are sisters, and I know we have this love for each other, do not feel as though I will somehow be upset if you say no. I understand what a big ask this is, given the state we live in, the governor that we have, and all of the risks that come along with this. So I had a lengthy conversation with the lawyer from Protect Democracy, and the very first question she asked me, y'all, was, do you have any personal fear of taking on and becoming a plaintiff in this lawsuit? And I'm gonna keep it real, y'all. What do you think my answer was? It was, yeah. And I said that if my sons were not 33 and 30, I might even make a different decision. They're grown men and I don't have to worry about them in the same way. And then my second question was, oh, well, who else is involved in this lawsuit? What companies are involved? Thus far, no companies, no big companies. They had approached dozens of corporations and institutions. And you know what they all said? They said no, because they were terrified of what the governor had just done to Disney. So for those of you unfamiliar, when Don't Say Gay happened, Disney got a lot of blowback from employees, from folks who go to Disney, who go to the Magic Kingdoms, and said, you need to say something. And when they did, the governor went after Disney and took away their tax-exempt status. Unprecedented in this nation. So yeah, I had some very real fear. So there ended up being three of us. A woman who has a company that's called Honey Fund. It's a honeymoon registry. 3 Black men who collectively owned 10 Ben and Jerry's, 2 in the state of Florida, and me. And we were successful. We didn't even expect that the judge would rule as quickly as he did. Not only did the judge rule in our favor, but the judge issued a scathing 44-page report that likened Governor DeSantis and the state of Florida to Netflix's Stranger Things, that we were in an upside down world. Now, DeSantis, of course, has since appealed, and there will be ongoing debate and legal wranglings over this. But this is one way that we can work to right some of these wrongs. And, you know, what I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I know I've had this conversation with Lee and with Mary Frances, how might we encourage the institutions with whom we belong and those organizations with whom we work to also take risk and stand up perhaps collectively as sectors even. Want to just stop and hold some space here. Any thoughts, any questions around this?
I just want to add, thank you so much for that, Chevara. I just want to add that I think we all know, what's wrong, and the system is really messed up. I'd use a different word, but mixed companies. So I'm just going to say the system is really messed up.
And Mary Frances, and we recording, so
we're recording too, right? Okay, right. It's the collective action. So when we think about it, Elon Musk is, a really rich man. And so he can, do whatever the hell he wants to do. And that's what he's doing. Donald Trump can do whatever the hell he wants to do. So we know in this society, it's all about power, and power equals money, right? And so for many of us who represent, who identify in marginalized groups, historically oppressed groups, we don't have, most of us don't have that power. We don't have the individual power, but we have the collective power. And I think that's where we need to really focus our attention. I heard a lot of pain here today. I heard a lot of hurt. I heard trauma, and there's a need for the healing. And there's also a really dire need for collective action to combat what's happening in this country. So to the extent, and that takes courage, because we got jobs, people are watching, and you may lose your job because being an activist, or you take a stand in someplace, but somewhere. But I think that's where we are. I was reminded of where we were in the 60s, where it really is about the sacrifice. It's about thinking about how we want to leave this world. It's about our collective humanity and all of those things. But it's going to take the courage to step out and collectively challenge what's going on.
Yeah, Mary Frances, I really appreciate, what type of ancestor will you be? Thank you for that, dropping that in, Lee. And that's really important. I mean, I think about the ways that we can help educate the organizations and the corporations that are in these cities who benefit from employee resources. I'm talking about like having actual bodies to work for their institutions, who are then impacted, these same human bodies impacted by the policies that exist in our communities. And so there, I think, is an incredible opportunity to encourage and have those types of conversations. And what does it mean, to reimagine our roles, our individual roles in this Jedi space, the institutional roles that some of us might have when we think about allyship, and how can we use the spheres of influence? Because we all have spheres of influence. In the example, the story I just shared with you, as an individual, right? I have full influence and control. Part of, and what Mary Frances just talked about, is really important, because I don't work for an entity in that way where I'm worried about being fired from something. But there have been times, I worked at a university once, and I remember choosing not to get involved in a statewide effort, because when I went to HR to ask them if I were to get arrested, because we were going to get arrested, and we had lawyers who had talked to us, and we were going to be, we were going to get out relatively quickly. But my HR department at the university could not give me assurance that I would not be fired if I got arrested. And so I chose not to take. I remember crying for weeks about it. I felt as though I had failed my comrades, because I needed my job, y'all, and I needed my healthcare benefits. And so I understand the nuance and the real fear and risk. And so where we have power to affect outcomes, even if we don't have the formal authority, is where I would offer that we focus most of our energy and attention. And, when we think about using our own power, our own individual power, our institutional power, how are we communicating our values? So many of you have already lifted up those things that are important to you, not just in your community, but that impact your lives, your livelihood, not just your day to day, but whether or not you live or die. And so how are we effectively communicating those? How are we fostering psychological safety, creating space, creating wide space for all types of perspectives in a room, and at the same time putting up the types of barriers so that we're not allowing harm to happen for ourselves or for those in our communities. Thinking about where we choose to spend our money. A lot of these institutions, on one hand, even thinking about Supreme Court and abortion, you pull back the, like in the Wizard of Oz when it fell and the Wiz was kind of there and he wasn't so great. You pull back the curtain and they're the same companies that were funding lawmakers who supported oppressive policies around reproductive health. So what does it mean then for us to hold accountable these institutions? Great that you signed on and that I saw you in the paper, but where's the money? Where's the money trail around that? Thinking about the policies that we have influence over. What does that look like in our own communities? Where can we challenge our lawmakers? And not because we necessarily have the time to show up in city council, in school board meetings, but what are the other ways we can be creative, especially in this virtual space, to have access to lawmakers? And several people have lifted this up already, like in our own learning journey, because we are on a spectrum. And I would imagine even here today, I've heard and learned things that I didn't know before, as you all have been sharing. And so being open to the possibility of expansion, because none of this, not our Jedi work, not even this public policy work, is about changing minds. Yes, we want policies to change. It's more about the expansion so that people, I think about even in our case, when I've been asked to speak about what's happening with my suit specifically, I'm not talking to the people who support me. The people who are listening to what I'm saying are those people who vehemently oppose wokeness. So how do I then hold space to have some conversation that connects some commonality around things like democracy and free speech? I mean, the language that I'm using to make connections to possibly get people to change their lens of how they think about wokeness and what it means for them. And when I think about organizationally, we think about voting and all the suppression and obstacles that have been in place since the 1965 Voting Act was put into place. Organizations that are providing time off and transportation. I've seen corporations have their leaders, their senior most leaders actually go and work the polls. So modeling what that looks like in institutions. Walmart, which has a whole other slew of issues. Interestingly, if you go to their website, they have an entire page about good public policy being good for business and the way that not that they're always doing this, but in rhetoric, it's a real interesting model for what they put out publicly specific to public policy, talking about catalyzing positive action on issues that are important to their consumers and their employees. And then what does it mean internally within the organizations with whom many of you are working to conduct internal policy audits, to understand, as Tammy, again, thank you so much for sharing that, shared about the injustices that she is facing around body size and how might then that inform folks who are having trans experiences, who are having Black womanhood experiences. What does it mean to really not just capture the data, but the anecdotal stories so that we are building empathy, capacity for empathy in organizations so that leaders, going back to that Edelman Trust Survey, recognize that that's here to stay in terms of how the respondents are thinking about leaders having to be responsible. You must now take a stance when one of these hot topics, one of these polarizing topics shows up in our world. All of us, I think, in this space hold power. I mean, for those of you who are DEI practitioners, the organizations, you're the expert in the room. They're looking at you for strategy. You're the leader in the space. And so thinking about, again, holding these institutions, and for those of you who work within institutions, it's different sometimes because the risk is different when you work within an organization and speaking out, taking on policy, taking on a governor, taking on a municipality. You shoulder a different risk. And I want to hold space for that because I think it would be unfair going back to what was lifted up, that Rhea lifted up before, right? There's a wide range, I personally believe, as a practitioner and as a human, as a Black woman, human in this space, of ways to be. And for me to criticize or suggest that someone beyond my journey, I think is unfair. And it's not true to even who I am, right? Because I'm not on your journey walk either, but I do invite us when we're helping to make decisions. And if we're making decisions in our own organizations, thinking about historically who's been marginalized, who's been harmed by these policies, who's continuing to be harmed by these policies. And to the extent, lifting up the one again about trans rights as it relates to sports, because we're talking about the highest level at Olympic level, NCAA, and we're talking about our young children, our nieces, our nephews, our children who are being impacted with school policy. Where do we need more education? Because that in the instance that you lifted up, I don't know enough. I recognize that I'm struggling and grappling here. So are we also human enough to know when we don't know enough? I don't know what I don't know is perhaps the language that we need to be thinking about. Curious, and I know that a lot, Barbara, I work in healthcare as the EID market director. When we had consistent issues popping up regarding our trans patients, it was important and enlightening to examine system-related obstacles that weren't previously considered. In our root cause analysis, we found 10 major system issues that were unintentionally negatively impacting individuals. Thank you for that. This is exactly what I'm talking about, right? I think that often we're not asking the depth of question that we need to, and we're not holding space for the wide range of experiences within a subsector. Because even talking about trans patients, you've got trans patients who are differently or disabled. You've got trans patients who are Black or Latinx, right? So there are all these levels to it, and there's not a one size fits all. And it is an ongoing evolutionary conversation that we're having. I appreciate you lifting that up. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. Curious, thinking about especially what you've heard from our learning community, the incredible, powerful, vulnerable stories that folks have shared. And I appreciate you lifting up too what's happening in your own organizations. Have you had any shift in perspective, thinking about what's possible, what we might be doing both individually as we take on some of these policies, these public policies, but also as an institution, what we might be able to do as a collective and as a JEDI space, where might there be some collective action that we could take? Curious about your thoughts, your perspective. Yeah, Barbara.
Yeah, I had to have a mind shift that, I'm doing differently, that, I really recognize governance and systemic, issues. And the one thing that kept me, quote unquote, awake at night was, how do we identify the systemic issues? They're insidious in our organizations. And we know historically, we know that they exist intentionally and unintentionally. And so, in the organization I work in, luckily we have a senior leadership at the enterprise level that have put a stake in the ground to say, we shall eradicate racism in our organization. And that's terrific. It's absolutely terrific. But for me, I had to do two things. I'm a white woman, and I had to get out of my own way to think that I could do this work effectively. Like, who am I to do this work? And I was, had a come to Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad conversation with somebody I respect very, very much about 3 years ago, who's an African-American woman who's an expert in this space. And she said, who, if not you, then who? What do you think why do you think that this work needs to fall on the backs of those who are the most oppressed? Right?
Yeah.
Why do you think you can't stand in the gap and speak as a white person to people in power who are white and maybe get to say things that we can't even say and not get kicked out of the room? So for me, it was, in essence, I needed that permission. I don't know why I needed the permission. And so I started to lean in. And when I started to lean in, I started to look at, all right, who owns the power and how do I get them engaged? And so putting together governance committees with senior-most leaders who signed a charter, who were specifically tagged to solve for these systemic issues in ways that we hadn't even looked at before. And so we're making, tremendous progress. We have a lot more work to do, but those are some of the things that shifted my own mental mindset about what I can and can't do. And that opened me up to all possibilities. And then my commitment to leaning in and not letting go of these issues. Like we can do things that we didn't realize that we could do.
Thank you for that, Barbara. Thank you. We are nearing our time, but I certainly just wanted to hold space if there was anyone else who wanted, and Hannah, thanks for dropping that in for folks who wanted to stay connected on LinkedIn to Hannah. Any other ways that public policy shift has happened for you within your own work, within your own institutions as a practitioner in this space? Making sure I don't, looking in chat. Yeah. We are so appreciative. This is ongoing dialogue, right? Beginning of conversations. 2 more years, we got another election coming up. There are some runoffs that are happening. So thinking about ways that we can even support our communities. How do we hold accountable, not just our lawmakers, but these institutions who benefit, who benefit greatly from the policies and that the lawmakers are instating. So when we think about all of the events and policy shifts that are shaking the public trust in institutions, and not just the responsibility, but the opportunity. I mean, I like framing it as opportunity for institutions to be more engaged and involved. How are we thinking about power? How are we leveraging power? And then, Barbara, I really appreciate you lifting up a plan for action that your organization is taking. And then what's that reframe? And then how does that ultimately morph itself into sustainable policy? Want to just also leave you with ways to connect with the Winters Group. So many extraordinary things that are happening. So appreciative for all of the team members who are here today. Lee, thank you again so much for your partnership in this work. We are all accessible and available to the extent that anyone wants to reach out to us. Yes, Cheryl, you have a hand raised. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to wait to the end to say this too. Sometimes you're in this space where, excuse me, you get a little discouraged because you feel like you're alone. And it's not until you start reaching out to others who are doing the same and similar kind of work that you realize that you do have a network. You do have a family. You do have supporters of people who are doing the work. So whenever you feel, isolated or in this space where, I'm not Atlas, I can't hold the world on my shoulders, and that it's really important to reach out to others who are doing the same thing, because you might be surprised that other people are feeling just as isolated as you are. And I think you can relate to this, Chevara. Living in Florida, you really do get discouraged unless you reach out to people and form coalitions, form partnerships, get into groups that people are doing the same thing you're doing. So I just wanted to say that at the end here.
Cheryl, you raised, I appreciate you lifting that up, because that's exactly what this learning community is, right? So when we think about all of us in this room who have the brilliance, who have the resources, who have the capacity, waning, ebbing and flowing, and the ways that we can be supportive for one another. So I really appreciate you lifting that up as reminder. So appreciative again for all of you for being here. Thank you so much. I'll stay on just for a couple of moments in case there are any questions, but thank you for your time. Thank you for your input. Thank you for your work. I am honored to be in community with such a brilliant, committed, unwavering group of practitioners in this space. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Chevara, and thank you, Lee, for yet another amazing virtual learning lab. We so appreciate your time and your talent. You are truly a treasure. Thank you so much to both you and Chevara and to Lee Morrison from the Winters Group. I'm so proud, just beaming over here.
Thank you, Mary Frances. Thanks, everyone. It's been a very healing space on a difficult day.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
What are the current sort of information sources that you're getting updated, news feed or those kinds of things?
Barbara, for what type of information specifically?
Yeah, relative to